shaping the political dialogue around water, then you've definitely come to the right session. Our session is featured by a presentation by none other than Josh Newton, who I'll introduce in a second. He'll give about a 30-minute presentation, and we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes for your questions and answers. So feel free to put your questions in the chat box. They'll be fielded at a later time. And to get us started, I'd like to introduce a good friend and colleague of mine, Josh Newton. He's an independent consultant on global water processes, governance, and stakeholder engagement. And he also is the brain behind the scenes of Josh's Water Jobs, which I'll talk about a little as well. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Josh to the floor.
Hey, thank you, Lindsay. It's a pleasure to be here today and excited to talk about this subject, global water governance. While most of you may know me from the website and Josh's Water Jobs, I actually do some water work as well. And this is kind of the focus of what I work on mostly. It was the subject of my PhD research. And now I try to work as a practitioner around these issues as well. So just to get started, we're all here because we love water. We know how important it is. And we know that it's not only necessary, but it's critical for agriculture, environment, energy, transportation, navigation, biodiversity, sanitation, hygiene, drinking water, all those things, but even such things as like tourism and spirituality and religion, which often are not taken into consideration. As we also know, we're in the middle of, some people may not say so, but we're in the middle of a global water crisis. We have billions of people without safe and affordable access to water and sanitation. Water quality is overall going down. Water stress is going up. We have more floods and droughts. And we're...
Oh, Josh, sorry, you're muted now. I don't know.
Something happened. Okay, am I back? Yeah, okay. So we are in the middle of this crisis, but at the same time, we have solutions. We're learn more and more about water governance. We're using technology more in data. More people in governments are aware that water issues are really important, and as well the private sector. We have water stewardship is increasing all over the world. So these are things to be excited about. And most of all, we have young professionals who are engaged in the field that will be our future champions in water. So this is just, you'll find this in the UN Water SDG 6 synthesis report, but it just shows again the connections that water has to all the different elements of the Sustainable Development Goals, and how the connections and the interlinkages and how important water is. So what is governance? Governance is not the same thing as government. There's many different definitions out there from a political science point of view, but overall it encompasses three things: authority, decision-making, and accountability. And then if you look at water governance, what is that? And GWP, Global Water Partnership, is the organization that has a definition that was used most frequently as the range of political, social, and economic administrative systems that are in place to develop and manage water resources and the delivery of water services at different levels of society. And these are both from formal and informal institutions. So just not government, but also NGOs, private sector, associations, academia. They're all involved in this kind of governance. And there's no one blueprint. There's no, say, silver bullet way to do water governance, because those who govern water, rivers, and watersheds find themselves at the intersection of several different and frequently contradictory normative pulls and pressure. So just basically, context is local, political systems are different, geography is different. So this all shapes how we do water governance. So why do we need water governance and not just government? because we have an increasing demand on water, and governments are only do not always provide water for all the sectors that are out there. You have access to water and water rights, lack of accountability and transparency. You have sector reform, decentralization, integration, integrated water resources management. Gender equality, very important to have actors that are not only government involved in promoting gender equality in water. And water is a highly capital intensive sector, and so it requires coordination. And this also includes, obviously, the private sector. And water policy is inherently complex. If you think about all the different aspects that go into developing a water policy and all the sectors and interlinkages you're talking about, it's hugely complex. And then before going to global water governance, there's this kind of in between, because water connects between sectors, places, people, geographies, and time. So there's multiple levels, and these all interact with each other. So in fresh water has become both a global and a local concern with many actors. So what is global water governance? Definition developed by Claudia Paul Wostel and others is the development and implementation of norms, principles, rules, incentives, informative tools, and infrastructure to promote change in behavior of actors at the global level in the area of water governance. So these aren't, say, laws necessarily, because things at the global level, there are no global laws. There are only global norms, principles, and rules that are not, say, enforced. And again, this is just like water governance at a national level or subnational level. It's a mix of informal and formal mechanisms. So you have the United Nations, but you also have NGOs, you have initiatives, programs that are a mix of different types of actors. So it's a mix of these two different, well, the formal and the informal. And so what is global water governance comprised of? So it's international law, which includes conventions, treaties, and customary international law. You have global intergovernmental agencies like the United Nations or the World Bank. You have regional bodies like the UNECE, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, or the SADC, Southern African Development Community. You have non-state actors and stakeholders. So those are NGOs, WWF, WaterAid. You have the private sector. And then you have global communities of scientists and water professionals. So many people ask when talking about the global level, so water is a very local thing. Do we actually need things at the global level? Do we need mechanisms at the global level to address water issues? So here I'll look at the why and the why nots. So the argument against having global water addressed at the global level is that many people argue it's not the appropriate scale and it should be at the local, national, regional, or basin level. Others argue that it's just too cross-cutting. It's kind of everywhere. So it's just, there's too many issues it touches, so it just makes it too complicated. Others think it doesn't add value to address it at the global level because of the different local contexts again. And then there's practical and political reasons that, especially with issues, say, transboundary waters that crosses political boundaries, certain countries don't want to discuss water globally because they think it might infringe on their sovereign right over the water that they have. And the argument for, there's a few of those as well. Virtual water. So water is, embedded in items that we produce, agricultural and otherwise, that we ship across, oceans to other places. There's an argument that, because we have this global water crisis, that coordination and collective action is necessary, that we need to get all on the same page so we can kind of address these issues together. There are mutual interdependencies. If there's a flood in one part of the world, that impacts food prices in another part of the world. Others say it's important to have a unified vision, that we're all moving forward together on the same page. And that as we do in these fora, we share these lessons that we've learned at the global level, and you can apply them locally in their own context, with their nuances. And then others, it's, as I mentioned, transboundary waters. There's an argument, there is a global convention on transboundary waters. Climate change now, we're seeing those impacts everywhere and mostly on water resources, in data, and just sharing that data. And then level the playing field to make sure everybody has an equal shot at resources and information. So when did this kind of global level action begin? I won't go into depth here, but there's a lot of events that took place. But what I've always been fascinated by is that the first international event on water was in 1851 in Paris. It was the International Sanitary Conference. And that was a precursor to what became the World Health Organization. So there were some of these meetings in the 1800s. In the early 1900s, there were more of the academic research associations started in the 1920s. One big shift was after World War II, when the United Nations was created. Then you had a lot of, the UN agencies started to address water issues. And you had, the creation of UNESCO and UNEP and others that started to look at water. But the real kind of big moment was after the 1990s. And this is when the Dublin conference happened, which was a precursor to Rio, the Rio conference, where integrated water resources management was really looked at more carefully. You have the creation of the World Water Council, Global Water Partnership, you have the MDGs. All these happened in the 90s, and it created a real watershed moment, no pun intended, where really the world started to focus more on water at this kind of the international and global level. And as noted in kind of the last bullet, there's the notables that came out of the research that people thought were the most influential, with Dublin being number one, Mar del Plata, which was in 1977, which was the last and to date the only UN conference on water. That will change in 2023. We will have our second one. The MDGs, the World Water Forum, that take place every 3 years, and the World Commission on Dams, which doesn't get referenced as much anymore. And now, of course, the SDGs. So what are the organizations that make up kind of the global water arena? This is a little outdated, and I haven't found another graphic that's really good that shows, but UN Water is a good representation of the main actors that kind of play in this global water arena. And those are divided between the UN Water members, capital M, which are on the left, and those are the UN agencies that have a water department and are represented in UN Water. And then you have the partners, and these are think tanks, NGOs, associations. So you can see a few of them there, from EMI to SIWI, Aquafed, WaterAid, and they're both, water resource management focused, as well as WASH, and from research and more activist. So it's a wide range, but overall, I believe there's a little between the two members and partners, there's probably about 80 or so now. In UN Water. And so these are the key players that make up the global water governance space. So the issues that have really influenced where we're at with global water governance. So basically how I got into global water governance is I was working on the 5th World Water Forum, which was the one in Turkey, ministerial process. And it came when I started working on that. And after the result, we had this ministerial declaration. And I started to ask myself, like, why is it that the World Water Council, along with the host government, were the ones who are organizing this ministerial level meeting on water when this wasn't in the UN? I asked the question, why is it that? And and the UN wasn't doing this. And so that became the research question of my PhD thesis: is why is there no UN institution dedicated to water, and why do we not have a global convention, more writ large, on water issues? And so some of the, say, thematic areas that have influenced how we came to be where we are the ones that are here on this slide. And the biggest one by far is transboundary waters. You know, some countries are concerned that if there's a global, say, entity, either an institution or a convention, that is dictating how they use water, how they use their waters, that they'll lose control of the current control they have over the water use in transboundary basins. So some countries are very, say, anti-global systems because they fear of losing their sovereignty over water use management. Integrated water resources management as well, because of the transboundary nature. And also that, again, kind of IWRM is more at a local and basin scale, so it doesn't fit that well into a global water governance scheme, except that it is applicable everywhere. It's just that there is no, again, there is no one size fits all. Water security is also, it's a term we use often, but certain countries have a very, say, more, say, militarized or securitized version of what security means. So it triggers different meaning for how they interpret the term. So it becomes a wording that is sometimes conflictive. Large infrastructure. This is more so in the, say, the 90s and early the 90s, where large infrastructure was, and it still is today, but it really was dominating the discourse around water at that point, and really caused, say, a lot of agreements, global agreements, to change based on countries' perspectives on large infrastructures and dams. The human right to water and sanitation. This is all something now that, both, they're actually, it's human rights too. It's plural now, that it's two different rights. But like when I first started working on these issues in the mid 2000s, late 2000s, this wasn't, say, a given, and countries were fighting to not have it recognized, or very passively so, and so now this is something that is accepted, but it was really influenced the trajectory of, say, global water governance in the early 2000s. Same with privatization around the same time as infrastructure. These are the very touchy issues back in the 90s and 2000s, which are still exist, but don't have as much influence about countries coming together to discuss water, say, within the UN system. Climate change. This is, again, now it's more, obviously there's still issues, but we're, moving more in a better direction. But again, this influenced where we were headed with global water governance in the 2000s, and then in land grabbing, which again, it's on people's, people are recognizing this, but it's still in discussions in the 2000s and up until now has, say, shaped language around certain issues around water issues. So the reasons why it's linked to, like why we do not have a convention, why do we not have a UN institution related to water, is, and some of these I've mentioned before, is that, so the sovereignty transboundary aspect is the main one why we do not have a convention on water, a larger convention on water. And more why we don't have a UN institution on water is competition. There's competition between all these UN agencies for budget and mandate. And so to consolidate it, to take everything and consolidate into one UN entity is just not realistic. And there would be a lot of fight back because of that. There's still, the water community is very fragmented, as you can see by all the organizations. and that keep growing. So it's really hard to bring that all together under one regime. The global is often a mirror to the national. So when the UN was created in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and the agencies, there were if you look at the UN agencies that exist, they mirrored ministries in national governments for the most part. Not exactly, but for the most part. And back in those times, there were no water ministries. Now this is something that's happening more often, that we have water ministries. But back when the UN was created, this was not the case. So water, again, was kind of like an orphan subject, which is the next bullet, that it's been forever very low on the agenda. Because it's been taken for granted. So this is now starting to change, but it's still not given the prominence of how important it is to every aspect of sustainable development. And for a long time, even now, it's maybe a little bit changing, but there's still no center of gravity in the water community. There's so many of these organizations out there, and there's no one go-to place where you can find what you're looking for, or who will solve water problem. There's no center of gravity. You could argue that maybe UN Water has been gaining in strength over the years, and you could argue that that is the case, that there is more of a center of gravity, but it's still very dispersed. And then other reasons that came up in this part of the research was the water is not seen as global, it's too complex, there's not a coordination, and the proliferation, the many organizations that exist. So what's happening right now? I mean, most of you, I'm sure, know about the Sustainable Development Goals and the SDG 6 on water and sanitation, but then water is also found in many other of the goals and some of the targets. In SDG 6 has 8 targets and 11 indicators. There is the International Decade for Action, Water for Sustainable Development, which is ongoing right now. And as I mentioned previously, in 2023, there will be the UN conference on the midterm comprehensive review of, long title. And so that will be the first, say, UN full-fledged conference on water since 1977, which may come as a surprise, but because it's this very, say, conflictive, contentious issue is the reason why it hasn't happened. So this is a very exciting time over the next 2 years. There was a prep meeting a few days ago in the General Assembly for this. So the next 2 years will be very exciting in terms of developing what this meeting will look like. It's 3 days over World Water Day in 2023. And you link to this, you have the Global Acceleration Framework, which is meant to help accelerate the implementation of the SDGs. But then you also have links to other global processes where water is very present. UNFCCC, CCC, the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction, amongst others. So I was asked as well to kind of give some insights about young professionals in this global space, in terms of working in it, in terms of this, the parliament that you all are a part of, and its impact on this global level. Because this is the work I've been doing now since I was in undergrad. And so, yes, I thought I'd bring a little bit of insight, and maybe, anyway, just some ideas and thoughts about for you all as you kind of embark on your professional careers. So you always hear that back in my day, because I feel like I'm still a young professional, but I'm not anymore. But like when I was a young professional in my late 20s, 30s, like what you have right now in the Parliament and say the other networks, the Water Youth Network, et cetera, those simply did not exist. There was no association, no network, for young professionals to kind of meet and gather and talk and discuss. I focused on transboundary in the earlier part of my career, and I tried to make a young professionals association for transboundary waters. And it kind of fell flat because there was very little support for that kind of thing back in the the mid 2000s. So I think it's wonderful that these exist now, because it provides a community, if you will. Like why I wanted to start working on that Young Professionals Association back in the mid 2000s was because I knew that 20 years from then, I'd be working with the same people that I was interacting with at conferences and working on projects and stuff like that. And so, and indeed, 20 years later or 15 years later, I am still working with many of those people, and many of them are my friends and part of my community, both water and outside. So you create these bonds, you create working relationships, and this pays off in the long run. So I'm very happy, and it's very encouraging to see these types of associations and networks present now, because they just provide a level of support that didn't exist when I was younger. And as a result, like, your voices, they are heard more now than, say, 5, 10, 15 years ago. It may not seem like it all the time, but you now you get a seat at many, say, organizations and initiatives and conferences. You're getting a seat at the table and you're getting up to the podium, where back in my day, that didn't happen as much. And so now it's really great to see that your voices are being heard more than ever, and that's only going on the up. So I find it very encouraging, because it's a diversity that we didn't have before, and yeah. So, and it's because you all are organized. There's not these disperse activities. It's you come to the table organized. You have representatives. You know where your speaking points are. And so I just encourage that you keep doing this, because it is valuable. And as a result, there are more opportunities and there is support out there. I mean, the fact that, the Parliament exists and gets financial resources and support, and same with the Water Youth Network and the others, or even like Young Water Solutions, which I sit on the board of. Like, these things exist because there are governments and donors who see value in them. And so there are opportunities, there are resources out there. And the platforms are a testament to that initiative. And I think the last thing I'll end with is that one thing that I don't think is acknowledged enough is how valuable the contributions of young professionals are to the larger work that's being done. Like, you can often argue that interns and young consultants in the UN and World Bank kind of run those organizations, and in a way it's very true, because the young professionals are the backbone of a lot of the work that gets done in those organizations. It was in my experience when I was younger, and it's the same now. And I don't think that gets talked about enough, that young professionals are putting in the hard work in the background, are often doing stuff and developing ideas and projects and writing reports that normally you'd think it'd be some super senior person who's doing this, but often it is the young professionals doing this. So I think that needs to be recognized and acknowledged. And yeah, the last thing is just stay in the water field. We need you. The world needs you. And so keep at it. And yeah, so thank you very much for your time.
Great, Josh. Thank you so much. I think it's really encouraging to get your feedback and hear that our voice is making a difference, and just to hear your timeline of being a generation that was trying to push for this, and to see what the impact is and what the spaces are now are for youth is really encouraging. We do have quite a few questions coming into the chat box. So I'd like to start with a question from Fabiana. She's asking, Josh, when you mentioned that there's no global convention for water, isn't the UN 1997 Water Convention a legal framework that could fit this category? Is there any reason why this wasn't considered? So mainly on the UN 1997 convention.
Yeah. Yeah, what I meant is, and I said writ large after, there's no general convention on water. So that would include, so the 97 convention, totally, yes, it's totally a global convention on water, but it's specific to transboundary waters. So it's just that one theme. There is no general convention on water that includes more subject areas than just the transboundary. But yes, that's totally a global convention. It's just limited in terms of what it addresses.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Juan Alberto. His question is, how does global water governance, how can this help solve local problems? Are there options for people when the government aren't listening to their demands? What's your perspective?
Yeah, it's tough. And this is one of the arguments that people would make where global isn't as useful. It's not something that at a local level you can elevate to a global level to ask for, say, help to to force a government to do something, because it's not a legal framework. But there are certain, say, global norms that influence, say, the local level, which is like the SDGs is one of them. Water quality standards at WHO is another. So there are these global, say, mechanisms that trickle down, if you will, to a local level, that give guidance from the global level, and the experience that's been gathered at the global level down to the local level. Another aspect of kind of is the knowledge side of what's in global water governance, and how that is, it's accumulation of what's happened around the world, and that can be shared. The different experiences can be shared from the global level down to the national base and local level.
That's good. I also liked in your presentation when you talked about kind of that differentiation, if you will, of global processes don't always trickle down to the local issues all the time. I think that was an important distinction to learn. Our next question is from Laurette. She's asking, in your opinion, what are the levels for integrating networks of young professionals into the diplomatic discussions, such as UN conventions, at the same level as NGOs, private sector, and authorities as an integral stakeholder? And I might just add to Laurette that as a partner of UN Water, WYPW has actually had a seat at many of these tables, especially even some board member positions. So just to be aware on that level of how WYPW has specifically been able to open up some seats. But Josh, if you have any other additions to that of other ways to integrate, we'd appreciate that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's difficult because you have these, large, say, if you say negotiating a resolution or something at the UN or a convention, although there hasn't been a new convention in a long time, you have, so many organizations, and this is from, NGO, private sector, academic, who would like to influence that process. But within the UN system, there's what it's called the major groups. And so I believe there's 9 of them that have, and I believe youth is one of them, that have representatives that are able to formally give feedback on certain processes within the UN system. So there, I believe, like farmers is one, there's science, women, indigenous peoples, and I can't remember all 9, but youth is one of them. NGOs, I think, is another. And so they do have a seat at the table and an opportunity to give feedback in UN processes. So at the high level political forum, when SDG 6 was being reported on in 2018, I believe it was, or 2019, I can't remember. Those groups and their representatives had an opportunity to give feedback when the review of SDG 6 was presented.
Thank you, Josh. One more point to add to that, Laurette, is WYPW also, we pushed for official board member position for the Global Water Partnership. So now youth has an actual voting right, whereas before it was observing. So just to iterate kind of the space being created. Josh, another question from Alex is, I would love to know what you think is preventing the emergence of a clear leader in global water governance. You've mentioned many of the key actors. It's not necessarily essential for the success of water governance, but the sector's fragmented nature does harm public perception. So is there any kind of insight onto maybe a clear leader within global governance with all of the different voices popping up?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's the competition between these different entities who would all like to be the leader. But that's why, I mentioned that kind of UN Water, things are coalescing around UN Water in terms of being kind of the neutral broker kind of leader has all these entities as a part of them. So they're able to, kind of work things out within UN Water itself to come with a unified position. Say at the national level, water governance, it's different in who is, say, clear leader, and you have different mechanisms in different countries based on the political systems, and some do it better than others. But yeah, so but mostly it's a competition between those who want to have their voices heard, is what prevents us from having kind of this center of gravity.
Another question from Najaf Ali. He's asking a transboundary water question, and he's asking we have many wars because of transboundary water. What is your opinion if it's possible to be solved by international water organizations or not, considering especially past countries and wars fought?
Actually, I mean, there hasn't been a war over water in a very, very long time between two, say, nation states. I think the last one was actually 4,000 years ago. So formally declared war between two or more countries has not happened. And this you can find in the Transboundary Freshwater Dispute Database at Oregon State University. Records all the, say, peaceful and violent events that have taken place between countries over water. But yes, that does not mean there's not conflict, but not violent conflict between countries. It could be a exacerbating factor in some cases, but it's not. Countries have not fought a war over water. But yes, in say, even just disputes over shared water, different countries have different mechanisms in place. Where there's treaties in place, some of these have dispute resolution mechanisms and they're different in what they look like. And when that's not the case, then there's the International Court of Justice that countries can go to when they have a dispute over shared water resources. And this has been utilized, I wouldn't say often, but it has been utilized to solve disputes between countries over water issues.
Thanks for that. Next question is, let's see here. Can you point out to how we can make the global governance appealing to nationalist governments, since it seems to be complicated?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, can you point out how to make global governance appealing to maybe governments just focusing on their own national plans, rather than how can we get them integrated into maybe more of a global process?
I mean, this would solve a lot of problems in the world if we could. And this is just not for water, but it's for any aspect of what we try to, say, solve at the global level, global governance in general. And so it's there's no clear-cut answer, but it's how do you incentivize, how do you get countries to see the benefit or receive benefit from engaging more actively at the global level? Because in the end, countries are looking after their own people. Certain countries have a more, say, holistic view of the world than others, but in the end, they're responsible for their own people. So countries really have to see a value in engaging at the global level, contributing to the global level, to be able to engage at that level. And there's a wide range, as we know, there's a wide range of countries that in their viewpoints on, but in the end, it's the system that we live in, kind of this Westphalian system and the UN system, that is very realist in the end, where countries are looking after their own citizens. And sometimes, countries see that addressing issues at the global level benefits the citizens in their own country. So it's not just for water; it's from everything from security to food to every issue that's discussed in the UN. Basically comes down to this, that countries have to see the benefit, and that's a very realist point of view of it, but I've cut from, it's kind of how things are.
We have lots of questions coming in. This is great. Before I turn to Josh's water jobs question, I do have one myself on political processes. I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned the first maybe more globally focused water and sanitation conference happened in the 1800s. That was new knowledge for me. And then you mentioned that Mar del Plata was maybe one of the first global conferences on water in the early 1900s, and that the next one will be in 2023, more specifically on this UN global process. Do you think that we should be worried about the gap in these two dialogues, or do you think that there is enough, if you will, from the World Water Forums and multiple other political processes happening? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I would just say it would be nice. I think this is where there are different views on this. I think it would be useful to meet more regularly at a high level to discuss water issues at the global level. So I would love to see every 5 years a major UN water conference at the highest levels. I think that would be useful for it's about elevating the importance of water, showing how important water is in terms of priorities for countries. It's where you can share lessons learned. Again, that unified vision and voice. So I personally think it would be useful. Whether it's concerning that there's been a big gap, I don't know. I mean, yeah. So the first one really was in 1977. It's going to be however many, 44 years, 46 years in between. Again, I think it would have been useful, but I don't know if it was detrimental that they didn't happen.
Makes sense. Okay, I'm going to go to a water job question. This question is from Ibeth. She's asking how young water professionals can get an international job in the country near him or her, when requisites are usually very specific for each place. I think we'd love to know more about your platform with this.
Hold on, so can I just see where the, which usually, yeah, I mean, in the end, it's, so if you're talking about, say, an international position, meaning that they will hire someone from anywhere in the world, then yes. Well, those actually, say, requirements are, say, not as stringent. They're not as strict because they do open up to everybody. But yeah, those jobs are obviously, there's not as many of them worldwide. And how to get them is, it's a big question. There's a lot of factors that go into play, but it's about trying to, it's about having international experience. So it's hard. It's a chicken and egg argument. How do you get international experience without first getting an international job, which requires international experience? But it's about getting exposure. It's about working on international projects in your own country, if possible, that give you exposure to the international level. And then it's kind of horizontally moving into an international job through say the contacts and connections and networks that you've made during that international work. So yeah, but yeah, getting, obviously I mean, it's one of the issues. I wish there were no, limitations on people applying from one job to in another country, but often many of the jobs I post on the website are only for nationals of that country, and that's just a reality and a limitation that we all have to work with. I mean, I can't work anywhere I want. I have to work where I'm legally allowed to work. And so it's international organizations for the most part that will, they'll hire anybody from any country mostly. And then certain countries, yes, but it depends on their, national immigration regimes, whether they will, organizations will hire non-nationals. And, given where things are at right now with COVID and stuff, it's been, I think countries are, tightening down that a little bit more. Like in the US where I am, especially with the last, our last president, it was much more difficult to get a job in the US than it was previously, based on the limitations that were put in place. That may change now. We'll have to see.
Thank you very much. And just to add to that, Beth, maybe more practical to Josh, since I've used your site a couple times for looking for jobs, I put the link in the chat, and he has it very well organized into jobs based by region. So just maybe a practical use of a resource, as well as a lot of our members have been able to, use the projects that they've done as some type of international experience. They're not paid. It is kind of exposing you, if you will. So always something to think about in your involvement. Josh, I love this question. It is from Farah. She's asked, what are resources, including books, research papers, podcasts, we should pursue that have guided you in your water journey?
Podcast didn't exist when I was in my water journey. So yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, so I mean, it's not the same now. You all have access to so many more resources than I did, and I'm kind of in the middle of it, compared to someone who's 15, 20 years older than me. So yeah, I mean, I'm a water policy person, so the journals, Water Policy and Water International, were always the ones I would kind of keep up to speed on. In my own, say, academic work. In terms of like keeping up to date with what's going on, there's been a shift lately but IISD, which is the International Institute for Sustainable Development, has listservs on different thematic areas. And there is one for water. I think they shifted platforms a little while ago, and it's not what it used to be, but it's slowly, I think, making a little bit of a comeback. But that has information on events, publications that come out, and so you can just sign up. It comes out in a daily digest, and so I've followed that for, I think, a decade now, and I post the jobs on there too because it has a large community. Yeah, and I think that's about it. Over the years, I just try to talk to people. I mean, it's unfortunately now we're in a different world, in that ideally I would be with you all and I could chat with you after giving this talk and any questions you might have, and we'd be at a conference or we'd be at World Water Week and chatting. And I think that makes this much more difficult, but that's often how I've kept up to date, is just chatting with people. I just noticed that Isabella put water science policy. The Global Water Forum actually is another one in USCA. Yep, those are all great that would have been put on there. Global Water Forum, is a good one. And so so I just try, people I've wanted to, or topics that I've wanted to, say, look at or research, or I would just email and chat to people, set up calls, set up talks, to, get to know them. And then that's how I've been introduced to a lot of the work over the years.
Terrific. Next question is, we have about 10 more minutes. This question is from Patrick. He says, another feature of water is that it relates to many questions such as economic growth. How do you think the development of countries is related to international water governance?
I'm not sure in terms of, global water governance, I'm not sure if it does, except that, well, the countries that are shaping, you can look at this in different ways, because you can say that countries that give a lot of funding for water projects around the world, which are more developed, have more of a say about how this, say, global water agenda is shaped, which is very true. At the same time, an example is Tajikistan, which is, say, not one of the big donor countries on water, but it's a smaller country, but it has shaped the global water agenda in many ways because of how they use the UN system in getting resolutions passed and getting the decade that now exists. That was something that they developed and sponsored. So you have smaller countries that can have an influence in utilizing the system. So I think there's an argument that can be made for both ways. Obviously, more economic clout influence definitely helps can help shape the agenda, but it's not always the case. You can have small countries who know how to work the system that can influence it in their favor as well.
This question is from Mike. He's asked, what is the key to the success of local innovation for good water governance? Speaking on local terms.
Yeah, so I'm not a local governance, but I'm more of the global level. So I don't think I could answer this question. I think maybe I just link it quickly to I said it a few times, but there's no blueprint, there's no one size fits all to, say, water management, water planning, water governance. There's so many different factors that go into these systems. And so innovation I would just say it's hugely important, because especially with climate change, there's the need to constantly adapt to the new circumstances. And that's just on from a climate standpoint. But if you have political changes or economic changes or any other number of changes, you have to be able to adapt. So innovation is I would say it is a key to success. The how of that I couldn't help with, and again, it would be more of a local context.
This question is on transboundary water, so your expertise plays well here. Question is, how important do you think the issue of transboundary water is in the Turkish summit piece in Afghanistan, which is to be held next month? Do you have any intel on that process, or?
I do not have any information on that process, but obviously for Turkey and for if it's Afghanistan, obviously transboundary is a key issue to both countries. So I don't know if I don't know if it's on the agenda or not, but I don't have any insight.
Well, that's actually all of our questions, and kind of ending at an appropriate time. Josh, do you have any last minute words you'd like to say before I wrap us up?
No, just like to repeat, keep on keeping on. Like, it's great to be able to talk with you all. Thanks for having me here. I really appreciate it. And hope to meet you at a conference someday in the world.
Thank you again, Josh, for joining us. And thank you to our co-organizers, ISW, for helping us put this on, as well as to our translator, Gael. I hope you guys learned a lot from this session. This is very applied, especially in the work of WYPW. And we hope to keep you involved in the conversation. Bye.